Of the Royal Charter of Nova Scotia. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are at Glover Garden, Nagasaki Prefecture, to observe and commemorate the 400th anniversary of the Royal Charter of Nova Scotia. The story begins with the personal history of Sir William Alexander, 1st Earl of Stirling. William Alexander, 1st Earl of Stirling, was a Scottish courtier and poet who was involved in the Scottish colonization of Charlesfort, Greater Port Royal, Nova Scotia, in 1629, and Long Island, New York. In 1621, as part of the European expansion overseas, King James I of England and VI of Scotland granted a royal charter appointing William Alexander to be mayor of a vast territory which was enlarged to a lordship and a barony. This area was to be known as New Scotland. In Latin, this translates to Nova Scotia. The area also included, at the time, what is now known as New Brunswick and Maine in the United States. The area was used to settle plantation, which in this case means legal claim of the new province. It was later increased, at least on paper, to include much of eastern Canada. The French claimed the same area as Acadia, while the Micmacs claimed it as their own land. The Micmacs and Acadians had no problem sharing the land with each other, though, so they may be referred to as the same claim. William Alexander, as Lord Stirling, was also appointed as Secretary of State for Scotland in 1626 and held that office for the rest of his life. Lord Stirling's efforts at colonization were not so successful. In monetary terms, his recruitment promises were unrealistic and gave very weak benefits for settlers. The Royal Charter gave Alexander rights to minerals and fisheries, the power to make laws, form a government, stop pirates, and seek peaceful relations with native people. It also gave him permission to build one or more forts. It would be 8 years before such a colony was established. In 1625, the year Charles I became King of England, a coat of arms was approved for New Scotland. It is basically the reverse of the Scottish flag, which is blue with the cross of St. Andrew. Nova Scotia is white with the cross of St. Andrew in blue. The royal seal of King James I is in the center. In the 1920s, the flag and coat of arms of the province of Nova Scotia were adopted, using the 1625 heraldry as the basis and inspiration. There was a New England, a New Holland, and New France. Why not a New Scotland? That's what King James I thought. Meaningless titles for land sold to different wealthy Scots were not enough to offset the cost of establishing a colony. The effort to establish a Scottish colony cost Alexander most of his fortune. When the region was returned to France in 1632, all the money invested was lost. He was given a small amount of compensation from the king, but it was nowhere near enough to restore his wealth. He became a poor noble, living on meager means for the rest of his life. In 1630, King Charles rewarded his service by creating him Lord Alexander of Tullibody and Viscount of Stirling and Viscount Canada. In 1639, he was also given the title of Earl of Dover. In 1636, King Charles told the Plymouth colony to turn over the yet unsettled Long Island to Alexander. In 1629, 8 years after the granting of a charter to establish the colony, and 4 years after the approval of a coat of arms, Sir William's son, Sir William Alexander the Younger, brought a group of 70 men and women to colonize New Scotland. More would follow later. A second group, led by Sir James Stewart of Killie, Lord Okicue, and comprised of English settlers, established a colony at Baline, Cape Breton, which is a few miles north of where the French would establish the fortress of Louisbourg. There they built Fort Rosemar, only to have the French destroy the settlement 2 months later. Meanwhile, Alexander, with the assistance of Claude de Saint-Étienne de la Tour, established his headquarters at Port Royal. This would be renamed Annapolis Royal in 1713. There, he oversaw the construction of Charles Fort, named in honor of King Charles I. It was designed by Captain Ogilvy and was in the shape of a pentagon, with many homeworks good for both offense and defense. It had 8 cannons mounted on it. 4 were culverines, and 4 were minions. That's it. Okay. The settlers also erected a house for Alexander and a storehouse. The fort itself was much smaller than the French fortifications that came later, and eventually Fort Anne, and was located on the edge of what is now the outer rampart. Here. That's good. Pointing out to the Annapolis Basin. Okay. During the first winter, 30 of the 70 Charles Fort settlers died. More colonists arrived in May 1630. This included the Micmac chief Sigip and his family, who had gone to England to meet the king. When Alexander went to England in the fall of 1630, he found negotiations underway for a return of the area to the French. In 1632, this area, along with the rest of New France, which was Canada and Acadia, was officially returned to France under the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. 47 of the Charles Fort settlers returned to England on the ship Saint Jean. This was one of the ships that later carried French settlers to Le Havre. They were under the command of the new governor, Isaac de Razilly. A few of Alexander's settlers remained in the colony. Since the Port Royal habitation, which was founded in 1605, was burned down and abandoned in 1613. The descendants of these Scottish settlers became the true original permanent European settlers to Nova Scotia. Claude de Saint-Étienne de la Tour came to what was then Acadia with his son Charles in 1610 to help settle Port Royal. In 1628, de la Tour was captured by the English during a voyage from France to Cape Sable and was taken to England as a prisoner. On Cape Sable, his son had built a fur trading post called Fort Lomeron. This was later renamed Fort La Tour, although it was identified as Fort St. Louis in the writings of Samuel de Champlain. De la Tour expected that Acadia would be lost to English due to French neglect. He decided to side with the English. He provided information about Acadia and assisted with plans to colonize New Scotland. In return, he was named a baronet of Nova Scotia. In 1630, he and his English wife joined a group of colonists and sailed for Cape Sable. He expected his son to join him and side with the English, in return for a title and other honors. However, Charles refused. His father then led an attack on the fort, but failed. That's it. Okay. Claude then had no choice but to accompany the other colonists to Port Royal which was now under English control. He later wrote to his son asking to be permitted to join him at Cape Sable. Charles agreed, but forced his father to make his house outside the fort. Early in the settlement, good relations had been established between the settlers and the Micmacs. An eyewitness account written by Richard Guthrie states that the Micmacs were infinitely loving to their wives and children and to one another, feasting when they meet till all their stores be gone, so every day serves itself, meaning that they provided for themselves on a day-to-day basis. According to Guthrie, the Micmacs he met were of fair carriage, a people among whom people may live very well, suggesting relations between the Micmac and the Scottish settlers were good. This would be very different in the next century, as priests like Father Luther pushed, lied, and threatened the Micmacs to make war against the English-speaking settlers then. Fort La Haye, National Historic Site of Canada, was designated in 1924 as the first permanent French settlement in Acadia, settled in 1632.